A widow stood on a dirt street corner with nothing left but flour and desperation, until a stranger bought every pie she had and changed everything. Her husband was gone. Her money was gone. The town had already written her off. But when a man with dust on his boots and silence in his eyes walked up and didn't ask questions, just paid, something shifted. This is the story of Clara Whitlock, a woman who rebuilt her world one crust at a time. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Clara's hands were shaking again, not from cold. The September sun was still heavy over the town of Red Bluff, baking the dirt streets into something close to clay. It was the kind of heat that made your dress stick to your back and your hair cling to your neck no matter how tight you pinned it. No, her hands shook because she'd run out of time. She stood at the corner of Main and 4th with a wooden crate at her feet and 6 pies wrapped in thin cotton cloth. Apple. The only thing she knew how to make well enough to sell. Her son Danny sat on the boardwalk behind her, kicking his heels against the wood and watching a stray dog sniff around the dry goods store across the street. He was 7, too young to understand how close they were to losing everything. Too young to know that if she didn't sell these pies today, they wouldn't eat tomorrow. "Mama, can I have a penny for candy?" Clara didn't turn around. "No, just 1 penny." "I said no, Danny." He went quiet. She hated the sound of that silence more than she hated the heat. The town moved around her like she wasn't there. Women in clean dresses crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her. Men tipped their hats but didn't stop. She'd become invisible in the 6 months since Thomas died. Worse than invisible. She'd become a reminder that death didn't care if you were young or strong or had a family depending on you. A reminder that the frontier took what it wanted and left the rest to rot. "Fresh pies," she called out, but her voice cracked halfway through. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Apple pies baked this morning?" A man in a bowler hat glanced her way, slowed for half a step, then kept walking. Clara's stomach turned. She could feel the weight of the flour she'd used, the sugar she'd scraped together, the lard she'd traded a week's worth of mending for. If these pies didn't sell, she had nothing left to barter. The landlord had already come by twice this month, standing in her doorway with his arms crossed and his patience thinning. She had until Saturday. 3 days. "How much?" The voice came from her left. Clara turned and saw a woman about her age, maybe a little older, holding a parasol like it might protect her from more than just the sun. 20 cents, Clara said. The woman's mouth twitched. "That's steep." "It's a full pie. Enough for a family." "I'll give you 15. Clara hesitated. 15 cents wouldn't cover the cost of the ingredients, but it was better than nothing. She opened her mouth to agree when another voice cut in. She said 20. Both women turned. A man stood a few feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, with a hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. His clothes were work-worn, dust on his boots, dirt under his nails, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He didn't look like someone who spent time in town. He looked like someone who came in when he had to and left as soon as the errand was done. The woman with the parasol stiffened. "I wasn't talking to you, Mr. Maddox." "I know." He stepped closer to Clara's crate and nodded toward the pies. "How many you got?" Clara blinked. 6. "I'll take all of them." She stared at him. "All 6? "That's what I said." The woman with the parasol made a small noise in the back of her throat and walked off without another word. Clara barely noticed. Her mind was stuck on the math. 6 pies at 20 cents each. $1.20. More than she'd made in 2 weeks. You want all of them?" she asked again, because it didn't make sense. Nobody bought 6 pies at once. Nobody. "Unless you're not selling." His voice was flat, not unkind, just factual. "No, I'm selling." She bent down and started pulling the pies out of the crate, her hands still shaking, but for a different reason now. "Do you need help carrying them?" "I'll manage." He pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and counted out coins into her palm. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles, and when he dropped the last coin, their fingers brushed for just a second. Clara pulled back like she'd been burned. "Thank you," she said, and hated how small her voice sounded. He didn't respond, just gathered the pies, 3 in each arm, balanced like he'd done it 100 times, and turned to walk away. Clara watched him go, her fist closed tight around the coins, her heart hammering in her chest. "Mama, who was that?" She looked down at Danny, who'd come up beside her without her noticing. "I don't know." But that wasn't entirely true. She'd heard the name. Maddox. She didn't know much about him except that he ran a ranch somewhere outside town and didn't come in often. People said he kept to himself. People said a lot of things, most of them gossip, and Clara had learned to ignore gossip a long time ago. Still, as she folded the coins into her pocket and picked up the empty crate, she couldn't stop replaying the way he'd said she said 20. Like it mattered. Like she mattered. By the time Clara got Danny home and put him to bed, it was past dark. Their house, if you could call it that, was a one-room shack at the edge of town with walls so thin you could hear the wind through the gaps in the wood. The roof leaked when it rained. The stove smoked when she tried to cook. But it was hers, for now. She sat at the table with the coins spread out in front of her and did the math again. Rent was 80 cents. That left 40. Flour, sugar, lard, firewood. She could make it stretch. Maybe. Her hands were still trembling. She didn't understand it. Didn't understand why a man she'd never spoken to would buy 6 pies without haggling, without asking what they were for, without treating her like she was selling something shameful just to survive. Most people in this town looked at her like she'd already failed, like widowhood was a disease she'd brought on herself. But he hadn't looked at her like that. He'd barely looked at her at all. 3 days later, Clara was back on the corner with another batch of pies. She told herself it didn't matter if he showed up again. She told herself she wasn't looking for him. But when the sun started to dip and the street began to empty, she felt something close to disappointment settle in her chest. Then she saw him. Same hat. Same dust. Same long stride that made it look like he had somewhere important to be. He stopped in front of her crate and nodded once. "How many today?" Clara swallowed. 6. "I'll take them." He paid without counting, without haggling, without saying anything except "much obliged" when she handed over the last pie. And then he was gone again, disappearing down the street like he'd never been there at all. It happened again the next week, and the week after that. By the 4th week, people started to notice. "Heard Cole Maddox has been buying up all your pies," Mrs. Pritchard said one afternoon, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite accusation, but wasn't far off. She ran the boarding house on 5th Street and made it her business to know everyone else's. Clara kept her eyes on the pie she was wrapping. "He's a customer." "Quite the regular customer, I suppose." "Funny, isn't it? A man like that, coming all the way into town just for pie." Clara looked up. Mrs. Pritchard's smile was thin and sharp, the kind of smile that drew blood if you weren't careful. "Is there something you want to say?" "Oh, nothing at all, dear. Just making conversation." But the damage was done. By the end of the day, Clara could feel the weight of the stares, the whispers that followed her down the street. She wasn't stupid. She knew what people were thinking. A widow. A man. Money changing hands every week. It didn't matter that she was selling pies. It didn't matter that he'd never said more than a dozen words to her. People saw what they wanted to see, and what they wanted to see was something worth talking about. It was late October when everything changed. Clara was at her usual corner, crate at her feet, Danny sitting on the boardwalk with a stick he'd been carving into something that might have been a horse. The air had turned cooler, and she'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders to keep the wind off. She had 8 pies today. She'd scraped together enough to make extra, hoping she could sell them to someone else, spread the risk a little. But when Cole Maddox walked up, he didn't just buy the pies. He stopped, looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since this whole thing started. "You make these every week?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Yes, sir." "How many could you make if you had more supplies?" She blinked. I don't know. Maybe 12? 15 if I had help." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving from her face to the crate to Danny and back again. Then he said, "I've got a proposition for you." Her stomach dropped. She'd heard that word before. Propositions were never good. Propositions were how women like her got backed into corners they couldn't get out of. But he kept talking, and his voice didn't change, didn't get softer or harder, just stayed steady. "I run a ranch about 10 miles west of here. Got 30 men working the land, and they're tired of eating the same slop every night. You make enough pies to feed them once a week. I'll pay you $2 a delivery." Clara's breath caught. $2? Every week. That was more than rent. That was more than food. That was enough to stop counting coins every night and praying they'd stretch. "You'd have to bring them out yourself," he continued. "I can't spare a man to come fetch them, and you'd have to keep a schedule. No missed weeks." "I can do that," she said, before she'd even thought it through. "It's a long ride, road's rough." "I'll manage." He studied her for another moment, then nodded. "First delivery next Saturday, dawn." And then he paid for the 8 pies, tipped his hat, and walked away. Clara stood there with the coins in her hand and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack a rib. Danny looked up at her, his face smudged with dirt. "Mama, what just happened?" She didn't know how to answer, so she just smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months, and said, "I think we're going to be okay." The first delivery almost killed her. Clara woke up at 3 in the morning, lit the stove, and started baking. 15 pies. It took every bit of flour and sugar she had, every ounce of strength left in her arms. By the time the sun came up, she was covered in sweat and her back ached like she'd been hauling rocks. But the pies were done. She loaded them into the back of the wagon she'd borrowed from the livery, another expense she'd have to figure out how to cover, and set off with Danny beside her. The road west was exactly as rough as Cole had said, rutted and uneven, full of rocks that made the wagon lurch and the pies slide around in the back, no matter how carefully she'd packed them. By the time she reached the ranch, her arms were sore from gripping the reins, and her dress was soaked through with sweat. The ranch was bigger than she'd expected. A sprawling main house, a barn, corrals full of horses, and several smaller buildings she couldn't identify. Men were already moving around, working, their voices carrying across the open land. Clara felt a sudden, sharp stab of panic. She didn't belong here. This wasn't her world. But before she could turn the wagon around, Cole stepped out of the barn. He walked over, looked at the pies in the back, and nodded. "Right on time." "I wasn't sure I'd make it," she admitted. "But you did." He reached into his pocket and pulled out $2, handing them over without ceremony. "Same time next week?" Clara nodded, clutching the money like it might disappear. "Yes, sir." He turned to leave, then paused. "You got a name?" Clara Whitlock." "Cole Maddox." He tipped his hat. "Appreciate the pies, Mrs. Whitlock." And that was it. No questions about her husband, no comments about her showing up alone, just business. On the way back, Danny fell asleep against her shoulder, and Clara let herself breathe for the first time all morning. $2. She had $2. And next week, she'd have 2 more. It wasn't much. But it was a start. By mid-November, the routine had settled in. Clara baked every Friday night, loaded the wagon before dawn, and made the ride out to the Maddox ranch. Cole always met her, always paid on time, and always kept the conversation short. The men on the ranch started to recognize her, tipping their hats when she passed, and a few of them even complimented the pies. It felt strange. Good, but strange. Then one Saturday, Cole didn't just take the pies and leave. "You ever think about expanding?" he asked. Clara frowned. "Expanding what?" "You're baking. There's other ranches around here." "They'd pay for what you're making." She stared at him. "You're saying I should sell to your competitors?" "I'm saying you're good at what you do. No reason to limit yourself." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd ever gotten from him, and it hit her harder than she expected. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and said, "I'll think about it." But as she drove away, she realized something. Cole Maddox wasn't just a customer. He was someone who saw her, not as a widow, not as a woman struggling to survive, but as someone capable of more. And that terrified her. Because if she started believing it, she'd have to actually do it. And doing it meant risking everything all over again. Winter came hard that year. The first snow fell in early December, and with it came a cold that seeped through the walls of Clara's shack and made every morning feel like a battle. She kept baking, kept making the deliveries, but the road got worse. Mud turned to ice. The wagon wheels slipped. Twice she had to stop and dig herself out of a rut, her hands so cold she couldn't feel her fingers. But she didn't miss a week. Cole noticed. She could tell by the way he looked at her when she pulled up, snow in her hair, and her face red from the wind. He didn't say anything, but the next week he had one of his men ride out with her on the way back just to make sure she got home safe. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Christmas came and went. Clara didn't have money for gifts, but she baked Danny a small cake and told him stories about his father until he fell asleep smiling. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And when she made her delivery to the ranch the day after Christmas, Cole handed her an extra $1. "What's this for?" she asked. "Holiday bonus." She looked at the coin in her hand, then back at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know." There was something in his voice, something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not charity, just acknowledgement. Like he knew what it cost her to keep showing up, week after week, and wanted her to know it didn't go unnoticed. Clara tucked the $1 into her pocket and climbed back onto the wagon. As she drove away, she realized her hands weren't shaking anymore. By January, people in town had stopped whispering. Or maybe Clara had just stopped caring. She had money now. Not a lot, but enough to pay rent on time, buy food without rationing every bite, and even put a little aside for emergencies. Danny had new boots. The roof still leaked, but she'd patched the worst of it. And every Saturday, she made the ride out to the Maddox Ranch. It became the center of her week, the thing she planned around, the thing that kept her moving when everything else felt too hard. She told herself it was just business, just a job. But that wasn't entirely true. Because somewhere along the way, she'd started looking forward to seeing Cole. Not because he said much, he didn't. But because when he looked at her, she didn't feel like she was drowning anymore. She felt like she might actually make it. The breaking point came in late February. Clara pulled up to the ranch like always, pies loaded in the back, Danny half asleep beside her. But when Cole came out to meet her, he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, older, with a thick beard and a suspicious look in his eyes. "This her?" the man asked. Cole nodded. "Clara Whitlock. This is Ben Harlow. He runs the Triple Creek Ranch about 15 miles north." Clara glanced between them, her stomach tightening. "Nice to meet you." Ben looked her up and down, then turned to Cole. "She makes all these herself?" "Everyone." Ben picked up one of the pies, unwrapped it, and broke off a piece of crust. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he grunted. "Not bad." Clara didn't know whether to feel insulted or relieved. Ben looked at her again. "You got time to take on another ranch?" Her mouth went dry. Maybe. How many pies?" 10 a week. Same deal as Cole's got. $2 a delivery. $4 a week. Clara's mind spun. That was more money than she'd ever had in her life. But it also meant twice the work, twice the baking, twice the risk. "I'd need to think about it," she said. Ben shrugged. "You got till Monday." And then he walked off, leaving Clara standing there with her heart in her throat. Cole stepped closer. "You don't have to say yes. I know. But if you do, I'll help you figure out the logistics." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't noticed before. He believed in her, maybe more than she believed in herself. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you deserve a chance." And just like that, Clara made her decision. Tell him yes. Clara's first delivery to the Triple Creek Ranch nearly broke her. She left town before dawn on a Monday. The wagon loaded with 25 pies, 15 for Cole's ranch, 10 for Ben Harlow's place. The weight made the wheels dig deeper into the muddy road, and twice she had to climb down and push while Danny pulled on the horse's bridle. By the time they reached Cole's ranch, her dress was caked in mud up to her knees, and her arms felt like dead weight. Cole took one look at her and frowned. "You all right?" "Fine," she lied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. He didn't look convinced, but he helped her unload the pies without comment. When she climbed back onto the wagon, he stepped closer and lowered his voice so Danny couldn't hear. "Triple Creek's another hour north. Road's worse than this one. I'll manage. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying you don't have to do it all in one day." Clara met his eyes. "I gave my word." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Stubborn. Broke," she corrected. "There's a difference." Something flickered across his face. Respect, maybe, or recognition. He stepped back and tipped his hat. "Be careful." She was careful, But careful didn't make the road any shorter or the wagon any lighter. By the time she reached the Triple Creek Ranch, the sun was high and brutal, and her hands were blistered from gripping the reins. Ben Harlow met her in the yard, arms crossed, looking her over like she was a horse he was thinking about buying. "You're late," he said. "The road's bad." "Road's always bad." He walked to the back of the wagon and pulled back the cloth covering the pies. He picked one up, turned it over, inspected the crust. Clara held her breath. Finally he grunted, "They'll do." He paid her the $2 without another word and walked off. Clara sat there for a moment, staring at the coins in her hand, feeling the ache in her shoulders and the exhaustion in her bones. Then she turned the wagon around and started the long ride home. She didn't get back to town until after dark. Danny was asleep against her side, his head bobbing with every rut in the road. Clara's eyes burned from squinting into the wind, and her back hurt so badly she wasn't sure she'd be able to stand when they finally stopped. But when she pulled up in front of their shack and counted the money in her pocket, $4 minus the cost of supplies, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. She'd done it. She'd made the deliveries. She'd kept her word. And she had $4 to show for it. It wasn't easy. But it was hers. The next week was worse. The weather turned, bringing rain that turned the roads into rivers of mud. Clara spent an entire day baking, her hands cramping around the rolling pin, her back screaming every time she bent to check the oven. She burned 2 pies and had to start over, which meant using up the last of her flour and staying up until midnight to finish. When she finally loaded the wagon Tuesday morning, she was so tired she could barely see straight. The ride to Cole's ranch took twice as long as usual. The horse kept slipping, the wagon kept getting stuck, and by the time she arrived, she was 2 hours late. Cole was waiting in the yard, and the look on his face made her stomach drop. "What happened?" he asked, walking toward her. "Rain," she said, climbing down from the wagon. Her legs buckled slightly, and she had to grab the side of the wagon to steady herself. "Road's a mess." He looked at her, really looked at her, and his jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be doing this alone." "I don't have a choice." "You do. You could hire help." Clara laughed, a short, bitter sound. "With what money?" "The money I'm paying you. That money's for rent and food and everything else." Cole didn't respond. He just started unloading the pies himself, moving quickly and efficiently, like he was trying to get her out of there before she collapsed. When the wagon was empty, he handed her the $2 and then pulled out another 50 cents. "What's that for?" Clara asked. "Extra time. You were late because of the weather, not because you didn't try." She stared at the coins. "I can't take that." "You already did." He closed her hand around the money and stepped back. "Don't make this delivery to Harlow's place today. Go home. Rest. Do it tomorrow." "I can't." "Yes, you can. One day won't kill him, and it might save you." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could handle it, but the truth was, she couldn't, not today. So she nodded, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove home without saying another word. That night she lay awake in bed and stared at the ceiling. Her body ached, her hands were raw. And somewhere deep in her chest, a voice whispered that she'd bitten off more than she could chew, that she was going to fail, that she was going to lose everything all over again. But she didn't. The next morning, she got up, loaded the wagon, and made the delivery to Ben Harlow's ranch. He didn't comment on the delay, just took the pies, paid her, and sent her on her way. And when she got home and added up the money, she realized she had enough to buy a second-hand oven from the blacksmith's wife, a real oven, big enough to bake 4 pies at once instead of 2. It wasn't much, but it was progress. By the middle of March, Clara had settled into a rhythm. She baked on Mondays and Tuesdays, delivered to Cole's ranch on Wednesdays, and made the run to Triple Creek on Thursdays. Fridays were for buying supplies and catching up on sleep. Saturdays and Sundays, she tried to give Danny something that felt like a normal childhood, taking him fishing in the creek behind town, teaching him to read from the one book she'd managed to keep when Thomas died, letting him run around and be loud and messy in a way that made the neighbors glare, but made him happy. The money kept coming in. $4 a week, every week. Clara paid her rent on time, bought food without counting every penny, and even managed to put a little aside in a tin can she kept hidden under the floorboards. It wasn't enough to call herself secure, but it was enough to stop feeling like she was drowning. And then the whispers started again. It started with Mrs. Pritchard, of course. Clara was at the general store buying flour when she overheard the woman talking to the shopkeeper's wife, her voice just loud enough to carry. "I'm telling you, it's not natural. A woman that young, making that much money, spending all her time out at those ranches with all those men." The shopkeeper's wife made a noncommittal sound. "Maybe she's just good at baking." "Oh, I'm sure that's what she's good at," Mrs. Pritchard said, her tone dripping with insinuation. Clara's hands tightened around the sack of flour. She wanted to turn around and say something sharp, something that would shut the woman up, but she didn't, because she knew it wouldn't matter. People like Mrs. Pritchard didn't care about the truth, they cared about the story. And the story they wanted to tell was one where Clara Whitlock was doing something shameful to survive. She paid for her supplies and left without looking at either of them. But the damage was done. Over the next few weeks, Clara felt the weight of the town's judgment everywhere she went. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Men stared a little too long. Even the preacher, who'd been kind to her after Thomas died, stopped acknowledging her in public. Danny noticed. "Mama, why doesn't Mrs. Pritchard talk to you anymore?" Clara kept her eyes on the road. "Some people don't know how to mind their own business." "What does that mean?" "It means they're nosy and mean, and you shouldn't worry about them." But she worried, not because she cared what they thought. She'd stopped caring about that a long time ago. She worried because if the whispers got loud enough, they might reach the ranches. And if the ranches started believing the stories, she could lose everything. She didn't tell Cole about it, didn't tell anyone, just kept her head down and kept working. But Cole noticed anyway. It was a Wednesday in late March, and Clara had just finished unloading the pies when Cole asked her to wait. She stood by the wagon, watching as he disappeared into the barn and came back a minute later with something in his hands. "What's this?" she asked. "Leather gloves," he said, holding them out. "Saw your hands last week. Figured these might help." Clara looked down at her palms. They were covered in calluses and half-healed blisters, the skin cracked and rough. She'd stopped noticing the pain weeks ago. It was just part of the job now. "I can't take these," she said. "Why not?" "Because—" She trailed off. Because people would talk. Because it would look like something it wasn't. Because she didn't know how to accept kindness without feeling like she owed something in return. Cole seemed to understand without her saying it. "They're gloves, Mrs. Whitlock, not a marriage proposal. You need them, so take them." She did. Slipped them on right there, and they fit almost perfectly. Her throat tightened, and she had to look away before he saw the wetness in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and turned to leave, but then he stopped. "People in town giving you trouble?" Clara's head snapped up. "What?" "I've got ears. Heard some things. Wanted to make sure you're all right." She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to lie, to brush it off, and pretend it didn't bother her. But another part, the part that was so damn tired of pretending, wanted to tell him the truth. "They think I'm doing something I'm not," she said finally. Cole's expression didn't change. "I figured. Does it bother you? Does it bother me that people are idiots?" "No, I got used to that a long time ago." Clara almost smiled. Almost. "It might hurt your reputation, being associated with me." "I don't have a reputation worth protecting." He met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze, something steady and sure. "And even if I did, I wouldn't change a damn thing." The words hit her harder than she expected. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and climbed onto the wagon. As she drove away, she realized her hands weren't shaking anymore. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, not from anything. April brought warmer weather and a new problem. Ben Harlow cornered her after a delivery and told her he was expanding his operation. He wanted 15 pies a week now instead of 10. Clara did the math in her head. That meant baking 30 pies total, 3 full days of work. And the extra $5 a week would put her income at $9, more money than she'd ever imagined having. But it also meant less time with Danny, less time to sleep, less time to do anything except bake and deliver and try to hold herself together. "I'll need to think about it," she told Ben. He shrugged. "You got 2 days?" She spent those 2 days barely sleeping. Danny asked her twice if she was sick, and she lied and said she was fine. But the truth was, she didn't know if she could do it. Didn't know if her body could take it. Didn't know if it was worth it. On the second night, she sat at the table with a pencil and a scrap of paper, writing out numbers until her eyes crossed. Rent, food, supplies, savings. If she took Ben's offer, she could put away $3 a week. In 6 months, she'd have enough to move out of the shack and into a real house. In a year, she could buy Danny new clothes and maybe even a real bed instead of the pile of blankets he slept on now. But it would cost her everything else. She was still sitting there when someone knocked on the door. Clara frowned. It was past 9, too late for visitors. She opened the door a crack and found Cole standing on the other side. "Mr. Maddox," she said, surprised. "Is something wrong?" "No, I just—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, glancing back at Danny, who was asleep in the corner. Then she stepped aside and let him in. Cole took off his hat and stood in the middle of the room, looking around like he wasn't sure what to do with himself. The shack felt even smaller with him in it. His shoulders nearly brushed the walls, and his head almost touched the ceiling. "What brings you out here?" Clara asked. "Heard Harlow made you an offer." Of course he had. News traveled fast in a small town, especially when it involved money. "He did." "You thinking about taking it?" "I don't know yet." Cole nodded slowly. He looked at the table, at the paper covered in numbers, and his jaw tightened. "You can't keep doing this alone." "I've managed so far." "Managed isn't the same as thriving." He turned to face her fully. "You take Harlow's offer, you'll work yourself into the ground. I've seen it happen. People push too hard, think they can handle it, and then one day their body just gives out." Clara crossed her arms. "What do you want me to do? Turn down the money?" "No, I want you to hire help. I told you I can't afford. I'll front you the money." She stared at him. "What?" "I'll loan you enough to hire someone. You pay me back when you can. No interest." Clara's heart was pounding. "Why would you do that?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Because I've watched you kill yourself for 3 months trying to prove you can do this, and I'm tired of standing by and letting it happen. I didn't ask for your help." "I know, but you need it anyway." The words hung in the air between them. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need anyone, that she'd gotten this far on her own, and she'd keep going the same way. But the truth was staring her in the face, written out in numbers on the table. She couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. "I don't know how to pay you back," she said quietly. "Then don't. Not yet. Just take the loan and hire someone to help with the baking. That's all I'm asking." Clara looked at him. This man who'd walked into her life 4 months ago and quietly, steadily, kept her from falling apart. She didn't understand why he cared, didn't understand what he got out of it, but she was too tired to question it. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." Cole nodded. "Good." He put his hat back on and moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing." "What?" "Stop calling me Mr. Maddox. It's Cole." And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Clara stood there for a long time, staring at the space where he'd been. Then she sat down at the table, picked up the pencil, and started writing a new list. This one wasn't about numbers. It was about possibilities. Hiring help turned out to be harder than Clara expected. Most of the women in town wouldn't work for her, either because they believed the rumors or because they didn't want to be associated with someone who did. Clara asked around quietly, trying not to draw attention, but every door she knocked on ended the same way. Polite refusals, nervous smiles, excuses that didn't quite hold up. She was about to give up when Danny came home one afternoon with a girl trailing behind him. "Mama, this is Iris," he said. "She helped me catch a frog." Clara looked at the girl. She was maybe 15, tall and skinny, with dark hair pulled back in a messy braid and dirt smudged across her cheek. Her dress was old and patched in several places, and her boots were 2 sizes too big. "Nice to meet you," Clara said carefully. Iris ducked her head. "Ma'am, where do you live?" "With my aunt, other side of town." "And your parents?" The girl's face closed off. "Dead." Clara's chest tightened. She knew that look, knew that tone, knew what it felt like to be young and alone and trying to survive in a world that didn't give a damn. "You good with your hands?" Clara asked. Iris blinked. "What? Can you bake, roll dough, follow instructions?" I think so." Clara made a decision. "I need help. 3 days a week, maybe 4. Pays 50 cents a day. You interested?" Iris stared at her like she'd just offered her the moon. Yes, ma'am. Good. Start tomorrow. Be here by 5. The girl nodded so hard Clara thought her head might fall off, then turned and ran off down the street. Danny looked up at his mother, confused. Why'd you hire her? Because she needs the work, and we need the help. It turned out to be one of the best decisions Clara ever made. Iris showed up the next morning at 4:30, her hair still wet from washing, her hands scrubbed clean. She didn't talk much, but she learned fast. Within a week, she could roll dough as well as Clara. Within 2 weeks, she was handling half the baking on her own. And the best part? She didn't ask questions, didn't pry into Clara's business, didn't care about the rumors or the whispers. She just worked, took her pay, and left. With Iris's help, Clara accepted Ben Harlow's offer. She started baking 30 pies a week, and the money poured in. $9. Every single week. It felt like a fortune. Clara paid Cole back the loan within a month despite his protests, and started putting away $2 a week in the tin can under the floorboards. For the first time since Thomas died, Clara felt like she had control over her life. But control was a fragile thing. It was late May when everything started to shift. Clara was at Cole's ranch, unloading pies, when one of the ranch hands, a man named Tommy with a crooked smile and too much charm, sidled up to her. "You make these all by yourself?" he asked. "Mostly," Clara said, not looking at him. "Impressive. Woman like you doing all this work. Must get lonely." Clara's hand stilled. She knew where this was going. She dealt with men like Tommy before, men who saw a widow and thought she was desperate enough to accept whatever scraps of attention they threw her way. "I manage," she said coldly. "I'm just saying, if you ever need company—" "She doesn't." Clara turned. Cole was standing a few feet away, his expression dark. Tommy straightened up, his smile faltering. "I was just talking, boss." "Then stop." Cole's voice was low and hard. "Get back to work." Tommy hesitated, then nodded and walked off. Clara exhaled slowly, her hands shaking slightly. Cole stepped closer, his eyes scanning her face. "You all right?" "Fine." "He bother you before?" "No, and I can handle myself." "I know you can, but you shouldn't have to." Clara didn't know what to say to that. So she just nodded and finished unloading the pies. When she climbed back onto the wagon, Cole stopped her. "I need to ask you something," he said. Her stomach tightened. "What?" "How long are you planning to keep doing this?" Clara frowned. "Doing what?" "This. The deliveries, the baking, all of it. As long as I need to." "And when do you stop needing to?" She didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, she hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been so focused on surviving week to week that she hadn't let herself imagine a future beyond that. "I don't know," she admitted. Cole nodded slowly. "You ever think about doing something bigger?" "Like what?" "Like selling to more ranches or opening a shop in town, or—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "I'm just saying, you've got a skill people want. No reason to limit yourself." Clara stared at him. "You want me to expand?" "I want you to have options." It was such a simple thing to say, but it hit Clara like a punch to the chest, because for the first time in her life, someone was telling her she could be more than what she was, that she didn't have to settle for surviving, that she could actually build something. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. Cole tipped his hat. "That's all I'm asking." But thinking about it and doing it were two different things. Clara spent the next few weeks turning the idea over in her mind, testing it from every angle. Could she really expand? Could she really take on more work, more risk, more responsibility? What if she failed? What if she lost everything she'd built? And underneath all of that, a quieter, more dangerous question. What if she succeeded? The answer came in mid-June when a man named Samuel Cross showed up at her door. He was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and a sharp suit that didn't belong in Red Bluff. He introduced himself as the owner of a hotel 2 towns over and said he'd heard about her pies from Ben Harlow. "I need someone to supply my dining room," he said. 20 pies a week, $3 a delivery. Clara's heart raced. That would bring her weekly income to $12. 12. It was more money than she'd ever dreamed of, but it also meant hiring more help, buying more supplies, renting a bigger space to work in. And most terrifying of all, it meant stepping fully into this new life. No safety net, no going back. I'll need some time to think about it, she said. Samuel Cross nodded. You've got until Monday. When he left, Clara sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. This was it. The moment where she either played it safe or took a leap. And she had no idea which choice was the right one. That night she rode out to Cole's ranch. She didn't know why, didn't have a plan. But when she pulled up and found him working in the barn, she climbed down from the wagon and walked inside. Clara, he said, surprised. What are you doing here? I need advice. He set down the tool he was holding and turned to face her fully. All right. She told him about Samuel Cross, about the offer, about the fear gnawing at her gut. Cole listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You scared? He asked finally. Terrified. Good. Means it matters. Clara laughed, a shaky, uncertain sound. That's not helpful. I'm not trying to be helpful. I'm trying to be honest. He stepped closer. You want my advice? Take the job. Hire more help. Rent the space. Do whatever you have to do, because the only thing worse than failing is spending the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd tried. Clara looked at him, and something shifted in her chest. She'd spent so long being afraid. Afraid of loss, afraid of risk, afraid of hoping for something better. But standing here, looking at Cole, she realized she was more afraid of staying stuck. All right, she said. I'll do it. Cole smiled, a real smile, the kind she'd never seen from him before. Good. And just like that, Clara Whitlock stopped surviving and started building. By the end of June, Clara had rented a small building on the edge of town, an old storage shed that smelled like mildew and had gaps in the walls wide enough to see through. But it had 4 walls, a roof that mostly didn't leak, and enough space for 2 ovens. She hired another girl, a quiet 16-year-old named May, who lived with her grandmother and needed the work. Between Iris and May, Clara could bake 40 pies a week without collapsing from exhaustion. The money was good. Better than good. $12 a week felt like winning a lottery she'd never entered. Clara paid her rent 2 months in advance, bought Danny new clothes that actually fit, and even splurged on a real mattress to replace the pile of blankets they'd been sleeping on. For the first time in over a year, she went to bed without her stomach in knots. But the peace didn't last. The problem started with Mrs. Pritchard, as most problems in Red Bluff did. Clara was at the general store buying sugar when the woman walked in with 2 of her friends, their voices loud and pointed. I heard she's got 2 girls working for her now, Mrs. Pritchard said, not bothering to lower her voice. Teaching them all sorts of things, I'm sure. One of the other women tittered. I wouldn't let my daughter near that place. Neither would I. A woman running a business like that, spending all her time with men at those ranches, it's indecent. Clara's jaw clenched. She finished paying for the sugar and walked out without acknowledging any of them. But the anger sat in her chest like a hot coal, burning hotter with every step. When she got back to the shed, Iris was rolling dough and May was checking the ovens. Clara set down the sugar and stood there for a moment, trying to calm the fury rising in her throat. Something wrong, ma'am? Iris asked, looking up. No, Clara said. Then, because she'd never been good at lying, she added, Yes, but it's nothing you need to worry about. Iris wiped her hands on her apron. People talking again? Clara looked at her, surprised. You heard? Everyone's heard, doesn't mean it's true. May glanced over but didn't say anything. Clara took a breath and forced herself to focus. Let's just get the baking done. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of rolling pins and the creak of the oven doors. But Clara's mind wouldn't settle. She kept replaying Mrs. Pritchard's words, the sneering tone, the assumption that Clara was doing something shameful just by existing. By the time the pies were done and the girls had gone home, Clara was so wound up she could barely think straight. She locked the shed and started walking, not sure where she was going until she found herself on the road heading west, toward Cole's ranch. It was stupid. It was late afternoon, and she had no reason to be out there. But she needed to talk to someone who wouldn't judge her, and Cole was the only person she could think of. She found him near the barn, fixing a fence post. He looked up when he heard the wagon, and his expression shifted from surprise to concern. Clara, what are you doing here? She climbed down, her hand shaking slightly. I needed to get out of town. He set down the hammer and walked over. What happened? Nothing. Everything. I don't know. She pressed her palms against her face, trying to hold herself together. People won't stop talking. No matter what I do, no matter how hard I work, they keep whispering and assuming and… Breathe, Cole said quietly. Clara dropped her hands and looked at him. I'm trying. You care what they think? No. Yes, I don't know. She let out a frustrated breath. I shouldn't care, I know I shouldn't. But it's exhausting being looked at like I'm doing something wrong when all I'm doing is trying to survive. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know what I think? What? I think they're scared of you. Clara blinked. What? You're a widow with no money and no help, and you built something out of nothing. That scares people, makes them feel small, so they tear you down to feel better about themselves. That's a horrible way to live. It is, but it's not your problem. He stepped closer, his voice steady. You keep doing what you're doing. Let them talk. Eventually, they'll get tired of it and move on to someone else. Clara wanted to believe him, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep fighting. Not against the whispers, not against the judgment, not against the constant weight of being watched and criticized. What if they don't move on? She asked quietly. Then you outlast them. Something in his tone made her look up. Cole was watching her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Not pity, not sympathy, just belief. Like he knew she could do this, even when she wasn't sure herself. Why do you care so much? She asked. He hesitated, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. Because you deserve better than what this town's giving you. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was enough. Clara nodded and climbed back onto the wagon. As she drove away, she glanced back and saw him still standing there, watching her go. Something stirred in her chest, something warm and unfamiliar and terrifying. She pushed it down and focused on the road. July brought heat that turned the shed into an oven and made the work almost unbearable. Clara, Iris, and May took turns stepping outside to cool off, but even then, the air was so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. They baked early in the morning and late at night, trying to avoid the worst of the heat, but it was never quite enough. The deliveries got harder too. The roads dried out and turned to dust, and the wagon kicked up clouds that got in Clara's eyes and coated her skin. She started wearing a scarf over her face, and even then she'd come home looking like she'd been rolled in dirt. But the work kept coming. Samuel Cross added another 10 pies to his order, bringing Clara's weekly total to 50. She hired a third girl, a quiet, serious 15-year-old named Ruth, and bought a third oven from a widow selling off her late husband's tools. The shed was cramped and hot and smelled like burnt sugar, but it was hers, and the money kept piling up. Clara was making close to $15 a week now. She moved out of the shack and into a small house on the north side of town. Nothing fancy, but it had real walls and a real roof and enough space for Danny to have his own room. She bought furniture, a table, chairs, a bed frame, things she'd never thought she'd own again. Danny thrived. He was eating better, sleeping better, smiling more. He'd made friends with a couple of boys his age, and they spent their afternoons running wild through the fields outside town. Clara would watch him from the window sometimes, laughing and shouting, and feel something tight in her chest loosen just a little. But with success came new problems. The other women in town didn't just whisper anymore, they outright avoided her. Clara would walk into the general store and conversations would stop. She'd pass people on the street and they'd cross to the other side. Even the shopkeepers, who used to be friendly, started treating her with cold politeness. It hurt, more than Clara wanted to admit. She'd never been popular, but she'd never been outright shunned either. And now, when she should have been celebrating everything she'd built, she felt more alone than ever. Except for Cole. He'd started coming into town more often, always with some excuse. Needed supplies, had business at the bank, was meeting someone about cattle, but he always found a way to stop by the shed, just to check in. He never stayed long, never said much, but his presence was steady, reliable. And Clara found herself looking forward to those visits more than she wanted to admit. It was mid-July when things came to a head. Clara was making a delivery to Cole's ranch when she pulled up and found him in the middle of an argument with one of his hands. The man, a wiry guy named Jack with a mean streak Clara had noticed before, was shouting, his face red. "I don't care what you say. She's a damn—" "Finish that sentence and you're fired," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous. Jack's mouth snapped shut. He glared at Cole, then at Clara, and spat into the dirt. "You're making a mistake." Then it's my mistake to make. Get out of my sight. Jack stalked off, muttering under his breath. Cole turned to Clara, his jaw tight. I'm sorry about that. Clara climbed down from the wagon, her heart still pounding. What was he saying? Nothing worth repeating. Cole. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He was talking about you, said some things he shouldn't have. I shut him down. Clara's stomach sank. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You're going to lose men if you keep defending me. Then I'll lose men. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. I don't give a damn what they think, Clara. And neither should you. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, but the truth was, standing there with him, she felt something shift, something she'd been trying to ignore for months. She cared what he thought, more than she should, more than was safe. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded and helped her unload the pies. When they were done, he handed her the money and said, You busy Saturday? Clara frowned. Why? There's a social at the town hall. Music, dancing, food. I thought you might want to go. Her heart stuttered. Are you asking me to go with you? Cole looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure how he'd ended up in this conversation. I'm asking if you want to go. If you do, I'll be there. It wasn't exactly a declaration, but it was close enough to make Clara's pulse race. She should have said no. Should have kept the distance between them, kept things professional. But she was so tired of being alone, so tired of fighting everything by herself. All right, she said. I'll go. Cole's expression softened just a little. Good. Clara spent the rest of the week second-guessing the decision. She didn't have a dress nice enough for a social, didn't know how to dance, didn't know what people would say when they saw her walk in with Cole Maddox, but she'd given her word and she wasn't going to back out now. On Saturday, she put on the best dress she owned, a simple blue cotton thing that was too big in the shoulders and too short in the hem, and let Iris pin her hair up. Danny watched from the doorway, grinning. You look pretty, Mama. Clara's throat tightened. Thank you, sweetheart. Are you going with Mr. Maddox? I am. Do you like him? Clara paused, her hand stilling on her skirt. He's a good man. That's not what I asked. She looked at her son, this 7-year-old who saw too much and understood more than he should. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I'm trying to figure it out. Danny nodded, satisfied, and ran off to play. Clara took a breath and headed out. Cole was waiting for her outside the town hall, leaning against a post with his hat in his hands. He straightened when he saw her, and something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or appreciation. Clara felt her cheeks heat. You clean up nice, he said. So do you. He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked into the hall together, and every head in the room turned to stare. Clara felt the weight of those stares like a physical thing. Saw Mrs. Pritchard's mouth fall open. Saw the shopkeeper's wife whisper something to her husband. Saw the judgment and the shock and the barely concealed scandal in every face. She almost turned around and left. But then Cole's hand tightened on her arm, just slightly, and he leaned down and murmured, Don't let them win. Clara lifted her chin and walked further into the room. The next hour was a blur. Clara stood by the refreshment table, trying to look like she belonged, while Cole talked to a few of the other ranchers. A couple of people nodded at her, most didn't. She was starting to think this had been a terrible mistake when Cole appeared at her side again. Want to dance? He asked. Clara's eyes widened. I don't know how. Neither do most people here. Come on. He led her onto the floor, and Clara felt every eye in the room follow them. The music started, a slow, simple waltz, and Cole put one hand on her waist and took her hand with the other. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Just follow my lead, he said quietly. She tried, stepped on his foot twice in the first 30 seconds, and mumbled an apology both times. But Cole didn't seem to care. He just kept moving, steady and sure, until Clara started to relax. You're doing fine, he said. I'm a disaster. You're dancing. That's all that matters. Clara looked up at him, and for the first time all night, she forgot about the people watching, forgot about the whispers and the judgment. It was just her and Cole, moving together in a room full of noise, and it felt right in a way she didn't know how to explain. When the song ended, Cole stepped back and bowed slightly. Clara couldn't help but smile. Thank you, she said. Any time. They stayed for another hour, mostly standing together near the edge of the room. A few people came over to talk to Cole, and he introduced Clara every time, his tone making it clear that anyone who had a problem with her could take it up with him. No one did. By the time they left, Clara felt lighter than she had in months. Cole walked her home, the two of them moving slowly through the quiet streets. When they reached her door, Clara turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "I know it probably cost you." Cole shook his head. "It didn't cost me anything. People will talk. People already talk." He met her eyes. "I don't care what they say, Clara. I care what you think." Her breath caught. "What I think? About this. About me. About—" He trailed off, looking frustrated with himself. "I'm not good with words." Clara's heart was racing. "You're doing fine." Cole took a step closer. "I know this is complicated. I know you've got a life you're building and a son to take care of and 100 reasons why this is a bad idea. But I need you to know, I'm not just buying pies from you." Clara's throat tightened. "I know." "Do you?" She nodded. "I think I've known for a while." And Clara didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to put into words the fear and the hope and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could have this. Could have someone who saw her as more than a widow or a scandal or a woman struggling to survive. So instead of saying anything, she stepped forward and kissed him. It was brief, tentative. Her lips barely brushed his before she pulled back, her face burning. Cole stood frozen for a moment, his eyes wide. Then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that made her chest ache. "That an answer?" he asked. "It's a start." He nodded slowly. "I can work with that." Clara went inside and closed the door, her heart still pounding. She leaned against the wall and pressed her hands to her face, feeling the heat in her cheeks and the wild, reckless hope rising in her chest. She'd just kissed Cole Maddox, in front of her house, where anyone could have seen, and she didn't regret it for a second. The next few weeks were strange. Clara kept up her routine, baking, delivering, managing the girls at the shed, but everything felt different. Cole came by more often, always with some excuse, but they both knew what it really was. They talked more, laughed more, and sometimes, when the girls weren't looking, Cole would catch her hand and hold it for just a moment before letting go. The town noticed, of course. The whispers got louder. But Clara found she cared less and less. She had work, she had money, she had Danny, and she had Cole, steady and sure, standing beside her when the rest of the world tried to knock her down. But not everyone was willing to let it go. It was late August when Ben Harlow cornered her after a delivery. Clara had just finished unloading the pies when Ben stepped out of his house and motioned for her to wait. "Need to talk to you," he said. Clara frowned. "About what?" "About you and Maddox." Her stomach tightened. "That's not your business." "It is when it affects my reputation." Ben crossed his arms. "People are talking, Mrs. Whitlock, saying you and Maddox are, well, you know what they're saying." "I don't care what they're saying." "Maybe you should. Because if this keeps up, I'm going to have to find another supplier." Clara stared at him. "You're threatening to fire me because of gossip?" "I'm protecting my business, and my business can't afford to be associated with scandal." Anger flared in Clara's chest. "I've delivered pies to you every week for months. Never missed a delivery, never given you bad product. And you're going to fire me because people are talking?" Ben's jaw tightened. "It's nothing personal." "It's completely personal." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "You're just like the rest of them. You don't care about the work. You just care about appearances." "That's how the world works, Mrs. Whitlock." "Then maybe the world's wrong." She climbed onto the wagon and drove off without another word, her hands shaking with rage. By the time she got back to town, she was so angry she could barely see straight. She went straight to the shed, where Iris and May were cleaning up. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Iris asked. "No," Clara said, "but it will be." She spent the rest of the day running numbers. If she lost Ben's account, she'd be down to 30 pies a week and $9 in income. It was still more than she'd started with, but it stung. Not because of the money, because of the principle. That night, she rode out to Cole's ranch. She found him in the barn again, and the moment he saw her face, he set down what he was holding. "What happened?" Clara told him. All of it. Ben's threat, the accusations, the way she'd been dismissed like her work didn't matter. Cole listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with every word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He's an idiot. That doesn't help me. No. But this will." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "I've been talking to some of the other ranchers. 4 of them are interested in your pies. If you take them on, you'll make up what you're losing from Harlow, and then some." Clara stared at the paper, her throat tight. "You did this for me?" "I did it because you're good at what you do, and because people like Harlow don't deserve you." She looked up at him and something broke open in her chest. "Why are you doing this, Cole? All of it. The loans, the connections, the everything. Why?" He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Because I care about you, Clara. More than I probably should. And I'm tired of pretending I don't." Clara's breath caught. "Cole, I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm just asking you to let me help. Let me stand beside you. Let me—" She kissed him. Hard this time, with all the fear and hope and desperate gratitude she'd been holding back for months. Cole's arms came around her, pulling her close, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt safe. When they finally pulled apart, Cole rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to take that as a yes." Clara laughed, breathless. "It's a yes!" They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the dim light of the barn. And Clara realized something. She'd spent so long trying to survive on her own, so determined to prove she didn't need anyone, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be supported, to be seen, to be wanted. It was terrifying, but it was also the best thing she'd felt in years. Over the next few weeks, Clara took on the new accounts Cole had lined up. 4 more ranches, 20 more pies a week, another $6 in income. She hired a 4th girl and expanded the shed, knocking out a wall and adding more space. The work was relentless, but it was hers. And for the first time, she wasn't doing it alone. Cole came by almost every day now. Sometimes he helped with deliveries, loading pies onto the wagon or riding alongside her to make sure the roads were clear. Sometimes he just sat in the shed and talked while she worked, his presence steady and grounding. And sometimes, when the girls had gone home and it was just the 2 of them, he'd pull her into his arms and kiss her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. The town kept talking. Mrs. Pritchard started a rumor that Clara and Cole were secretly married. Someone else claimed they'd seen them together at night, doing things Clara didn't even want to think about. But Clara stopped caring. Let them talk. Let them judge. She had work. She had Cole. And she had a future that looked brighter than anything she'd dared to hope for. By the end of September, Clara had saved enough money to buy the shed outright. It wasn't much, just a rundown building on the edge of town, but it was hers. No more rent, no more landlord, just her name on a piece of paper that said she owned something. She stood outside the shed one evening, watching the sun set over the dusty street, and felt something settle in her chest. She'd done it. She'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into something good. And she wasn't done yet. Cole found her there, standing in the fading light. He didn't say anything, just came up beside her and slipped his hand into hers. "You all right?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Better than all right." "Good." He paused, then added, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About you. About us. About what comes next." Clara's heart started to race. "What are you saying?" Cole turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm saying I want more than this. More than stolen moments and secret kisses. I want—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I want you and Danny. I want a life with you if you'll have me." Clara stared at him, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. "Cole, I know it's fast. I know you've got your business and your independence and 100 reasons to say no, but I'm asking anyway." He squeezed her hand. "Marry me, Clara." The world seemed to stop. Clara looked at this man, this quiet, steady, impossible man who'd walked into her life and refused to let her fall, and felt everything she'd been holding back come crashing down. "Yes," she said. Cole blinked. "Yes?" "Yes." Clara laughed, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I'll marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and Clara felt the last piece of her broken heart click back into place. They didn't tell anyone right away. Clara wanted to wait until she'd figured out how to explain it to Danny, and Cole agreed without argument. So for 2 weeks, they kept the secret between them, stealing moments when they could and trying to act normal when they couldn't. But Danny figured it out anyway. Clara was in the kitchen one evening washing dishes when he walked in and sat down at the table. She could feel him watching her, and when she finally turned around, he was smiling. "What?" she asked. "You're going to marry Mr. Maddox, aren't you?" Clara's hand stilled on the dish towel. "What makes you think that?" "Because you're happy, and you're never happy unless something good happened." Her throat tightened. She set down the towel and sat across from him. "Would that be all right with you? If I married him?" Danny shrugged. "I guess. He's nice, and he doesn't treat me like I'm stupid." "You're not stupid. I know, but most grown-ups don't know that." He picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Would we move to his ranch?" "Probably, eventually." "Would I get my own room?" Clara smiled. "I think that could be arranged." Danny nodded, satisfied. "Then yeah, it's all right with me." Relief washed over her. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you, you know that?" "I know, Mama." 2 days later, they told the girls at the shed. Iris grinned and hugged Clara so hard she nearly knocked her over. May smiled shyly and offered her congratulations. Ruth just nodded and went back to rolling dough, but Clara caught the hint of a smile on her face. The town found out a week after that, when Cole walked into the general store and asked the shopkeeper where he could buy a wedding ring. By nightfall, everyone in Red Bluff knew. Clara could feel the weight of the gossip pressing down on her when she walked through town the next day, but for once, she didn't care. Let them talk. She was marrying Cole Maddox, and nothing they said could touch that. Mrs. Pritchard, predictably, had opinions. She cornered Clara outside the post office, her expression pinched. "I heard the news," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't approve. "Did you? It's quite sudden, don't you think?" Clara met her eyes. "I don't, actually." "Well, I just hope you know what you're getting into. A man like that—" "A man like what?" Clara interrupted. "Hard-working, honest, kind. You're right, Mrs. Pritchard. I don't know what I'm getting into, but I'm willing to find out." Mrs. Pritchard's mouth thinned. "You're making a mistake." "Then it's mine to make." Clara stepped around her and kept walking. She was shaking by the time she got to the shed, but it was a good kind of shaking, the kind that came from standing up for herself instead of shrinking back. Iris took one look at her and grinned. "Let me guess. Mrs. Pritchard? How'd you know?" "Because you've got that look, the one you get when someone says something stupid and you actually tell them off." Clara laughed despite herself. "I'm getting predictable." "You're getting braver," Iris corrected. "There's a difference." The wedding was set for mid-October, just after the harvest. Clara didn't want anything big, just a simple ceremony with a few witnesses and maybe a meal afterward. But Cole had other ideas. "I want to do it right," he said one evening when they were sitting on the porch of her house. "I want people to see that I'm proud to marry you." Clara looked at him. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for you." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just leaned against his shoulder and let herself believe just for a moment that everything was going to be all right. The weeks leading up to the wedding were chaos. Clara kept up her baking schedule, but she also had to figure out what to wear, where to hold the ceremony, and how to manage the logistics of moving her entire life to Cole's ranch. The girls helped where they could, but most of it fell on Clara's shoulders. Cole, to his credit, tried to help. He offered to hire someone to handle the move, to pay for a new dress, to take care of all the details Clara was drowning in. But Clara was stubborn, and she wanted to do it herself. Wanted to prove she could handle it. It was a mistake. By the first week of October, Clara was exhausted. She wasn't sleeping well, wasn't eating enough, and the constant pressure of trying to keep everything running smoothly was wearing her down. She snapped at Iris over a burned pie, forgot to deliver an order to one of the ranches, and nearly broke down crying when Danny spilled flour all over the kitchen floor. Cole found her sitting on the floor of the shed one evening, surrounded by half-finished pies and supplies she'd forgotten to put away. She didn't hear him come in, didn't realize he was there until he crouched down beside her. "Clara." She looked up, and the concern in his eyes nearly broke her. "I'm fine." "You're not. I just need a minute." You need more than a minute. He sat down beside her, not touching, just present. Talk to me. Clara pressed her palms against her face. I don't know how to do this. Do what? All of it. The wedding, the move, the business. I'm trying to keep everything together, and it's falling apart anyway. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You don't have to do it alone. I know, but I don't know how to let people help me, then start learning. He pulled her hands away from her face and held them gently. You've spent so long fighting for everything by yourself that you've forgotten it doesn't have to be that way. Let me help. Let the girls help. Let people in, Clara. She wanted to argue, wanted to say she could handle it, but the truth was she couldn't, not anymore. So she nodded and let herself lean against him, feeling the weight of everything she'd been carrying start to ease just a little. The next day, Cole hired a woman from town to help with the move. Iris and May took over most of the baking so Clara could focus on the wedding. Ruth started managing deliveries. And slowly, piece by piece, Clara let go of the control she'd been clinging to so desperately. It was terrifying, but it was also a relief. The wedding was held on a Saturday in mid-October, in the yard behind the town hall. The weather was cool and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that felt like a gift. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress that Iris had helped her pick out, and her hair was pinned up with a few wildflowers Danny had picked that morning. Cole stood at the front, dressed in a clean suit that looked like it had been tailored just for him. When Clara walked toward him, his expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. There weren't many people there. A few of Cole's ranch hands, the girls from the shed, a couple of the ranchers who'd been buying Clara's pies, and Danny, standing beside Cole with a grin on his face that made Clara's heart swell. The ceremony was short. The justice of the peace said a few words, asked them to repeat their vows, and pronounced them married. Cole kissed her, gentle and sure, and the small crowd clapped. That was it. No drama, no scandal, just two people standing in front of witnesses and promising to build a life together. Afterward, they had a meal at the ranch. Cole's men had set up tables in the yard, and there was more food than Clara had seen in years. She sat beside Cole, watching Danny run around with the other kids, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. But peace didn't last long. The trouble started a week after the wedding, when Clara went to make a delivery to Samuel Cross's hotel. She pulled up with the usual 20 pies and found Samuel waiting outside, his expression tight. Mrs. Maddox, he said, and the way he said her new name made her stomach drop. Mr. Cross, is something wrong? I'm afraid I'm going to have to cancel our agreement. Clara's hands tightened on the reins. What? Why? It's nothing personal, but my clientele, well, they've expressed concerns. About the pies? About you. He looked uncomfortable. They don't feel comfortable eating food prepared by a woman of your reputation. Clara felt like she'd been slapped. My reputation. I'm sorry, Mrs. Maddox, but business is business. He turned and walked back into the hotel, leaving Clara sitting there with 20 pies and no buyer. She drove back to the ranch in a daze, her mind spinning. That was $3 a week, gone, just like that. When she told Cole, he was furious. He can't do that. He already did. Then I'll talk to him. No. Clara shook her head. It won't help. People have made up their minds about me, and nothing you say is going to change that. So what? You're just going to let them push you out? I'm going to find other buyers. I'm going to keep working, and I'm going to prove that I don't need people like Samuel Cross. Cole looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, then let's do it. Over the next few weeks, Clara scrambled to replace the lost income. She reached out to other hotels, other ranches, anyone who might be interested in buying pies. Some said yes, most said no, but she kept pushing, kept fighting, and slowly she started to rebuild. It wasn't easy. There were days when Clara wanted to give up, wanted to walk away from the whole thing and let someone else deal with it. But she didn't, because she'd learned something over the past year. She'd learned that she was stronger than she thought, that she could survive things she never imagined surviving, and that giving up wasn't in her nature. By November, Clara had replaced most of the lost income. She'd picked up 2 new ranches and a boarding house on the edge of town. The work was relentless, but it was hers. And with Cole beside her, it felt manageable. Living at the ranch took some getting used to. Clara had spent so long being on her own, making her own decisions, that suddenly having to share space with someone else felt strange. Cole was patient, giving her room to adjust, but there were still moments when Clara felt like she didn't quite belong. Danny, on the other hand, thrived. He loved the ranch, the horses, the open space, the men who treated him like he mattered. Cole started teaching him to ride, and within a month, Danny was galloping across the fields like he'd been born in a saddle. Clara would watch them sometimes, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands, and feel her chest tighten with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or hope, or just the quiet, overwhelming realization that she'd somehow ended up with a life she'd never thought she'd have. But not everything was perfect. Cole's ranch hands were respectful, but Clara could feel their uncertainty. They didn't know how to treat her, whether she was the boss's wife or just another woman they had to be polite to. And Clara didn't know how to bridge that gap. She wasn't good at small talk, wasn't good at making people comfortable, so she kept her distance and focused on her work. One of the hands, a younger man named Sam, was the exception. He started coming by the shed when Clara was baking, offering to help load the wagon or fix something that had broken. He was polite and friendly, and Clara appreciated the effort, but Cole noticed, and he didn't like it. "You spending a lot of time with Sam?" he asked one evening. Clara looked up from the ledger she was working on. "He helps with the deliveries sometimes. Why?" "Just asking." "You're not just asking." Cole set down the book he'd been reading and sighed. "I don't like the way he looks at you." Clara blinked. "What?" "He looks at you like, I don't know, like he's got ideas." "Cole, he's 20 years old and he's being polite." "I know, but I don't trust it." Clara set down the pencil and crossed the room to where Cole was sitting. She put her hands on his shoulders and looked him in the eye. "You're jealous." "I'm not." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Maybe a little." "There's no reason to be. I married you, not Sam, not anyone else." "You." Cole's expression softened. "I know. I don't want to lose you." Clara's chest tightened. "You're not going to lose me." "You sure about that?" "Yes." She leaned down and kissed him, slow and deliberate. "I'm sure." By December, Clara's business had stabilized. She was baking 50 pies a week again, delivering to 6 different locations, and making close to $14. The shed was running smoothly, the girls were reliable, and for the first time in months, Clara felt like she had a handle on things. But then winter hit hard. The first snow came in early December, and it didn't stop for 3 days. The roads became impassable, the shed was freezing, and Clara had to cancel deliveries for the first time since she'd started. She hated it, hated feeling like she was letting people down, but there was nothing she could do. Cole tried to reassure her. "It's just weather. They'll understand. I gave my word, and you'll keep it, just not today." Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. So she stayed at the ranch, pacing the floor and watching the snow pile up outside, feeling useless. When the roads finally cleared, Clara made up the missed deliveries and apologized to every single client. Most of them were understanding. A few weren't. One of the ranchers, a man named Howard, who'd always been difficult, told her he was switching suppliers. "I need someone I can count on," he said. "You can count on me." It was 1 week. 1 week is enough. Clara drove away from that conversation feeling like she'd been punched in the gut. That was another $2 a week gone. Another setback. Another reminder that no matter how hard she worked, she was always one mistake away from losing everything. When she got back to the ranch, she didn't go inside, just sat in the wagon, staring at the house, trying to pull herself together. Cole found her there 20 minutes later. "What happened?" he asked. Clara told him. All of it. The canceled account, the frustration, the fear that she was never going to be enough. Cole listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he climbed onto the wagon beside her. "You know what I think?" he said. "What?" "I think you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I think you're so busy worrying about what you're losing that you're not seeing what you've built." Clara looked at him. "What have I built?" "A business, a reputation, a life. You've got 4 girls working for you, 6 ranches buying from you, and enough money to pay your bills and then some. You've taken every setback and turned it into something better, and you're still standing." His words hit her harder than she expected, because he was right. She'd been so focused on the failures that she'd forgotten to see the wins. "Thank you," she said quietly. Cole put his arm around her and pulled her close. You don't have to thank me. Just stop being so hard on yourself. Clara leaned against him and let herself breathe. They sat there for a long time, watching the sun set over the snow-covered fields, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. Christmas came quietly that year. Clara baked pies for all the ranch hands and made a special one for Danny, filled with apples and cinnamon and enough sugar to make his eyes light up. Cole gave her a leather-bound journal, and when she asked what it was for, he said, "For keeping track of everything, or writing down whatever you want. It's yours." Clara didn't know what to say, so she just kissed him and promised she'd use it. The new year brought new challenges. One of the girls, May, left to get married. Clara was happy for her, but it meant finding a replacement, which took time she didn't have. She ended up hiring a woman named Ellen, older and more experienced, who took charge of the shed in a way that both relieved and intimidated Clara. Ellen didn't ask permission. She reorganized the workspace, changed the baking schedule, and started negotiating directly with suppliers to get better prices. Clara didn't know whether to be grateful or annoyed. "She's pushy," Clara said to Cole one night. "She's efficient," Cole corrected, "and she's making your life easier." "I know, but I don't like feeling like I'm not in control." "You're still in control. You're just sharing it." Clara sighed. "I'm not good at sharing. I've noticed." She swatted his arm, but she was smiling. Because he was right. Again. By February, Clara had settled into a rhythm. Ellen ran the shed, Iris and Ruth handled most of the baking, and Clara focused on deliveries and managing the accounts. It was a good system. A sustainable system. And for the first time since she'd started this whole thing, Clara didn't feel like she was constantly on the edge of collapse. But just when she thought things were stable, Cole came to her with an idea. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, "what if you expanded?" Clara looked up from the ledger she was working on. "Expanded how?" "Opened a shop in town, sold pies to regular people, not just ranches." Clara's heart started to race. "That would cost money." "I know, but you've got savings, and I could help." "Cole, just think about it. You've built something here, Clara, but you're limiting yourself by only selling to a few buyers. If you had a shop, you could reach more people, make more money, build something bigger." Clara didn't know what to say. The idea terrified her. A shop meant rent, overhead, more employees, more risk, but it also meant possibility, potential, a chance to take everything she'd built and turn it into something even greater. "I'll think about it," she said, and she did. For weeks she thought about it, ran the numbers, talked to Ellen and Iris, looked at empty buildings in town. And the more she thought about it, the more it felt like the right move. So in early March, Clara signed a lease on a small storefront on Main Street. It wasn't much, just a single room with a counter and a window, but it was hers. She spent 2 weeks cleaning it, painting the walls, and setting up shelves. Ellen helped with the logistics, and Iris designed a sign that read "Whitlock's Pies" in bold letters. The shop opened on a Saturday morning in late March. Clara stood behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly, and watched as people walked by. Some stopped to look. A few came inside. And by the end of the day, she'd sold 12 pies. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. Over the next few months, the shop grew. Word spread that Clara's pies were the best in town, and people started coming from miles away to buy them. Clara hired another girl to help run the shop, and Ellen took over most of the ranch deliveries. The business was thriving, and for the first time, Clara felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was succeeding. But success came with its own set of problems. The more visible Clara became, the more people talked, and the more they talked, the harder it was to ignore. Mrs. Pritchard started a rumor that Clara had bought the shop with money she'd gotten through questionable means. Someone else claimed Clara was using cheap ingredients and charging too much. And a few people outright refused to buy from her, saying they didn't support women who didn't know their place. Clara tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the work and let the gossip roll off her back. But it wore on her, made her second-guess herself, made her wonder if she was doing the right thing. One evening, she was closing up the shop when a woman she didn't recognize walked in. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with a tired face and a baby on her hip. "Are you Mrs. Maddox?" the woman asked. "I am." "I heard you're hiring." Clara hesitated. She wasn't, not officially. But something about the woman's expression, the quiet desperation, the way she held her baby like he was the only thing keeping her standing, made Clara pause. "What's your name?" Clara asked. Anna? You have experience baking, Anna? Some. I worked in a kitchen back east before I came out here. I'm good with my hands. I need work. My husband died 6 months ago, and I'm running out of options. Clara's chest tightened. She saw herself in this woman, saw the fear and the determination and the bone-deep exhaustion, and she knew, without a doubt, that she was going to hire her. Can you start Monday? Clara asked. Anna's eyes filled with tears. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Clara nodded and handed her a piece of paper with the shop's address. Be here at 6. When Anna left, Clara stood alone in the shop and felt something shift. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Anna, about Iris and Ellen and Ruth and May, about every woman who'd been told she couldn't and decided to prove them wrong. Clara locked up the shop and walked home, her head held high. By April, the shop was doing better than Clara had dared to hope. She was selling nearly 70 pies a week between the shop and the ranch deliveries, and the money was steady. Anna turned out to be a hard worker, quiet but reliable, and she fit into the rhythm of the business without complaint. Clara started paying her $1 a week plus extra for any overtime, and the gratitude in Anna's eyes every payday reminded Clara why she was doing all of this. But growth brought attention, and attention brought problems. It started with a visit from the town council. 3 men in clean suits showed up at the shop one Tuesday morning, their faces serious. Clara was behind the counter helping a customer when they walked in. She finished the transaction and turned to face them. Mrs. Maddox, the tallest one said. His name was Fletcher, and he owned the bank. We need to have a word with you. Clara's stomach tightened. About what? About your business. There have been complaints. What kind of complaints? Fletcher glanced at his companions, then back at Clara. Some of the other business owners feel that your establishment is, well, it's creating an unfair advantage. You're undercutting prices, drawing customers away from established shops. Clara stared at him. I'm selling pies. That's not illegal. No, but it's causing tension, and the council has a responsibility to maintain harmony in the business community. Harmony? Clara repeated, her voice flat. You mean you want me to raise my prices so the other shops don't have to compete? We're asking you to be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm charging what people are willing to pay. If the other shops can't keep up, that's not my problem. Fletcher's expression hardened. Mrs. Maddox, I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. The council has ways of making things difficult for businesses that don't cooperate. Clara felt anger flare in her chest, hot and sharp. Are you threatening me? I'm advising you. Well, here's my advice. Clara stepped closer, her voice low and steady. If you or anyone else on that council tries to interfere with my business, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of men you are. Now get out of my shop. Fletcher's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to respond, but one of the other men put a hand on his arm and shook his head. They left without another word, and Clara stood there, shaking with adrenaline. Anna came out from the back room, her eyes wide. Are you all right? I'm fine, Clara said, though her hands were trembling. Just men trying to push around a woman they don't think belongs here. What are you going to do? Clara took a breath and straightened her shoulders. I'm going to keep working, and I'm going to prove them wrong. That night, Clara told Cole about the council's visit. He was furious, pacing the floor of their bedroom like a caged animal. They can't do that, he said. They already did. Then I'll talk to them. No. Clara stood and put her hand on his arm. I handled it, and I'll keep handling it. This is my fight, Cole. Let me fight it. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. All right. But if they try anything, you tell me. I will. But Clara knew the council wasn't going to let it go, and she was right. Over the next few weeks, small things started going wrong. The supplier who'd been selling her flour suddenly raised his prices. The landlord who owned the shop's building mentioned that the lease might need to be renegotiated. A health inspector showed up unannounced, poking through the kitchen and making notes on a clipboard. Clara dealt with each problem as it came, refusing to back down. She found a new supplier, negotiated with the landlord, passed the inspection with flying colors. But the constant pressure was exhausting, and she could feel it wearing her down. One evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the ledgers, when Cole came in and sat across from her. You look tired, he said. I am tired. Then take a break. Let Ellen handle things for a few days. Clara shook her head. I can't. If I step back now, they'll see it as weakness. Who cares what they see? I do. Clara set down the pencil and rubbed her eyes. I've spent my whole life being underestimated. Being told I'm not good enough, not strong enough, not worth listening to, and I'm done with it. I'm done letting people push me around just because I'm a woman. Cole reached across the table and took her hand. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Clara. Yes, I do. Because if I don't, the next woman who tries to do what I'm doing will have to fight the same battles all over again, and I won't let that happen. He squeezed her hand. Then I'm with you. Whatever you need. Clara's throat tightened. Thank you. By late May, the pressure from the council had eased. Clara didn't know if they'd given up or just moved on to easier targets, but she didn't care. The shop was thriving, the deliveries were steady, and for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. And then Danny got sick. It started with a cough. Just a small thing, nothing to worry about. But within 2 days, he was running a fever and couldn't keep food down. Clara stayed up all night with him, wiping his forehead with a cool cloth and trying not to panic. By the 3rd day, Danny was delirious, calling out for his father in his sleep. Clara sent for the doctor, who came and examined him and said it was pneumonia. He gave Clara some medicine and told her to keep Danny warm and rested. Will he be all right? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor hesitated. I don't know, Mrs. Maddox. Pneumonia is unpredictable. He's young and strong, which helps. But you need to be prepared for the worst. Clara felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She nodded numbly and saw the doctor out, then went back to Danny's room and sat beside his bed. Cole found her there an hour later, holding Danny's hand and crying silently. He didn't say anything, just pulled up a chair and sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The next few days were the longest of Clara's life. She barely left Danny's side, feeding him medicine and broth and praying to whoever might be listening that he'd pull through. Cole took over the shop and the deliveries, and Ellen and the girls kept everything running without complaint. On the 5th day, Danny's fever broke. Clara woke up in the chair beside his bed and found him looking at her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. Mama? He said, his voice hoarse. Clara's chest collapsed with relief. She leaned forward and took his hand. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm thirsty. She laughed through her tears and got him water. He drank it slowly, then fell back asleep. Clara sat there watching him, feeling like she'd just survived a war. When Cole came in later, she stood and walked into his arms, letting herself fall apart for the first time since Danny had gotten sick. Cole held her tight, his hand stroking her hair. He's gonna be all right, he said quietly. I know. But I almost lost him, Cole. But you didn't. He's still here. You're still here. That's what matters. Clara nodded and let herself believe it. Danny recovered slowly, spending most of June resting and eating everything Clara put in front of him. By July, he was back to his normal self, running around the ranch and driving the hands crazy with questions. Clara watched him and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but perspective. Because she'd built a business. She'd built a reputation. She'd built a life. But none of it mattered as much as the people she loved. And she'd almost forgotten that in her rush to prove herself. One evening, she and Cole were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Clara was quiet, lost in thought, and Cole seemed to sense it. You all right? He asked. Clara nodded. I've been thinking. About what? About what matters. About why I'm doing all of this. She turned to look at him. I started baking pies because I needed money to survive. But somewhere along the way, it became about proving I could do it. Proving I was strong enough, smart enough, good enough. And I almost lost sight of why I was fighting in the first place. Cole waited, letting her work through it. I want to build something that lasts, Clara continued. Not just for me, but for Danny. For the girls who work for me. For every woman who's been told she can't. She took a breath. But I don't want to lose myself in the process. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I sacrificed everything that mattered just to prove a point. Cole reached over and took her hand. Then don't. Find a balance. Let other people help. Trust that the work you've already done is enough. Clara smiled. You make it sound easy. It's not easy, but it's worth it. She leaned against him and watched the sky turn orange and pink. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. By August, Clara had made some changes. She promoted Ellen to manager of the shop, giving her full authority to make decisions and handle day-to-day operations. She cut back on deliveries, keeping only the most profitable accounts and letting go of the ones that caused more stress than they were worth. And she started spending more time at home with Danny and Cole, instead of chasing down every opportunity that came her way. It felt strange at first, like she was giving up. But the more she let go, the more she realized she wasn't losing control. She was gaining freedom. The shop kept growing. Ellen turned out to be a better manager than Clara had ever been, streamlining operations and finding ways to increase profit without increasing hours. Anna took on more responsibility, training the newer girls and keeping the kitchen running smoothly. And Iris, who'd been with Clara since the beginning, started talking about opening her own shop someday. Clara encouraged her. "You should do it. You've got the skill and the work ethic. You'd be great." Iris grinned. "You think so?" "I know so." By September, the business had stabilized into something sustainable. Clara was making close to $20 a week, more money than she'd ever imagined having, and she'd started putting the extra into savings, not just for emergencies, but for the future, for Danny's education, for expanding the business even more, for building something that would last long after she was gone. And then one day, she got a letter. It came from a man named William Cross, Samuel's younger brother, who ran a chain of hotels across 3 territories. He'd heard about Clara's pies from someone who'd eaten at the shop, and he wanted to discuss a business arrangement. If Clara could supply his hotels, 6 locations in total, he'd pay her $10 a week per location. $60 a week. Clara read the letter 3 times, sure she'd misunderstood. But the number didn't change. She showed it to Cole that night, her hands shaking slightly. He read it, then looked up at her. "This is big," he said. "I know." "What are you going to do?" Clara sat down across from him. "I don't know. It's more money than I ever thought I'd make, but it's also more work, more pressure, more risk. You don't have to decide right now." "I know, but I need to decide soon." She paused. "What do you think I should do?" Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you should ask yourself what you want, not what you think you should want, not what other people expect, just what you want." Clara thought about it. Thought about the long nights baking, the deliveries in the rain and snow, the constant pressure to prove herself. And she realized something. She didn't want to keep fighting. Not like this. Not anymore. "I want to build something stable," she said finally. "Something I can pass on to someone else when I'm ready. Something that doesn't require me to work myself to death just to keep it running." Cole nodded. "Then that's what you should do." Clara wrote back to William Cross the next day. She thanked him for the offer, but explained that she wasn't in a position to take on that level of commitment. Instead, she offered a smaller arrangement, 2 hotels instead of 6, with the possibility of expanding later if things went well. He agreed. By October, Clara had hired 3 more girls and rented a second building to use as a production kitchen. Ellen managed the shop, Anna ran the production kitchen, and Iris handled deliveries. Clara oversaw everything, but she wasn't doing the day-to-day work anymore. She was managing, planning, building. And for the first time, she felt like she had control over her life instead of her life controlling her. The year turned into winter, and then spring, and then summer again. Danny turned 9, tall and strong and full of energy. He spent most of his time at the ranch, learning to work cattle and fix fences and do all the things Cole's men did. Clara would watch him sometimes, covered in dirt and grinning, and barely recognize the quiet, scared boy he'd been 2 years ago. Cole's ranch prospered too. With Clara's income added to his own, they were able to expand, buying more land, hiring more hands, improving the house. The ranch became one of the most successful operations in the territory, and people started treating Cole with a respect that bordered on reverence. But Cole didn't care about any of that. What he cared about was coming home at the end of the day and finding Clara in the kitchen, or on the porch, or sitting by the fire with a book. What he cared about was the life they'd built together. By the time Clara turned 30, she owned 2 shops, employed 15 women, and had enough money saved to retire if she wanted to. But she didn't want to retire. She wanted to keep building, keep creating opportunities, keep proving that women could do more than the world expected them to. One afternoon, she was sitting in the original shop going over paperwork when a young woman walked in. She was maybe 18, with nervous eyes and a baby on her hip. Clara recognized the look immediately: desperation, fear, the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would give her a chance. "Can I help you?" Clara asked. The woman hesitated. "I heard you hire women. Is that true?" "It is." "Do you have any openings?" Clara looked at the woman, really looked at her, and saw herself 5 years ago. Saw the struggle and the determination and the refusal to give up, no matter how hard things got. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Margaret." "Can you start tomorrow, Margaret?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Yes. Yes, ma'am." Clara handed her a piece of paper with the address of the production kitchen. "Be there at 6, and bring your baby if you need to. We'll figure it out." Margaret left, clutching the paper like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever held. And Clara sat there, feeling something warm and solid settle in her chest. This was what it was all about. Not the money, not the success, but the chance to give other women what someone had given her. A chance. A lifeline. A way forward. Over the next few years, Clara's business became a fixture in Red Bluff. Women came from all over the territory, looking for work, and Clara hired as many as she could. Some stayed for a few months. Some stayed for years. But all of them left with something they hadn't had before. Skills, confidence, hope. The town's attitude toward Clara shifted too. Slowly at first, then all at once. The women who'd crossed the street to avoid her started nodding when they passed. The men who'd dismissed her as a scandal started tipping their hats. Even Mrs. Pritchard, who'd spent years tearing Clara down, stopped by the shop one day and bought a pie without saying a word. Clara didn't gloat, didn't rub it in anyone's face. She just kept working, kept building, kept proving that success wasn't about being liked. It was about being undeniable. By the time Danny was 15, he was working full-time on the ranch. He was strong and capable, with Cole's steady demeanor and Clara's stubborn determination. He talked about taking over the ranch someday, and Clara knew he'd be good at it. Better than good. He'd be great, but Danny had dreams beyond the ranch. He wanted to go to college, wanted to study business and law, and come back to help run not just the ranch, but Clara's businesses too. Clara encouraged him, even though the thought of him leaving terrified her. "You're going to do amazing things," she told him one evening. Danny grinned. "I learned from the best." Clara's throat tightened. "You did that all on your own." "No, I didn't. You showed me what it looks like to fight for something, to build something out of nothing, to never give up, even when the whole world's against you." He paused. "That's not something you can learn in a classroom, Mama. That's something you live." Clara hugged him tight, feeling tears prick her eyes. Because somewhere along the way, she'd stopped just surviving. She'd started thriving, and she'd taught her son to do the same. The years kept rolling forward. Clara opened a third shop in a neighboring town. Ellen retired and opened her own bakery, using everything Clara had taught her. Iris did the same. Anna eventually took over as manager of the flagship shop, and she ran it with the same quiet competence she'd always had. And Clara stepped back even more, letting the businesses run themselves while she focused on what mattered most. Family, community, legacy. She and Cole grew old together, their love deepening with every passing year. They had their fights, stubborn people always did, but they always came back to each other, always found their way home. Danny went to college, just like he'd planned, and came back 4 years later with a degree and a fiancée. He took over the ranch and turned it into an empire, expanding operations across 3 territories and employing over 100 people. He married a smart, capable woman who reminded Clara of herself, and together they had 4 children who ran wild across the same fields Danny had once explored. Clara watched it all unfold, feeling a quiet satisfaction she couldn't quite put into words. Because this was what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just survival, not just success, but the chance to build something bigger than herself, something that would last. On a cool evening in late September, when Clara was 62 and the world had changed in ways she never could have imagined, she sat on the porch of the ranch house with Cole beside her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled like grass and dust and home. "You ever think about how far we've come?" Cole asked. Clara smiled. "Every day." "You proud of what you built?" "I'm proud of what we built, she corrected. I couldn't have done it without you. You could have. You would have found a way. Clara shook her head. Maybe. But it wouldn't have been as good. It wouldn't have meant as much. She reached over and took his hand. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. A partner. Someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Cole squeezed her hand. You gave me the same thing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower. And Clara thought about everything she'd learned over the years. All the mistakes she'd made. All the battles she'd fought. All the moments when she'd wanted to give up but didn't. Because here's the truth about resilience. It's not about being strong all the time. It's not about never breaking down or never feeling scared. Resilience is getting back up after you've been knocked down. It's trying again after you've failed. It's believing, even when you have every reason not to, that tomorrow might be better than today. Clara had learned that the hard way. She'd learned that strength wasn't something you were born with. It was something you built, one small choice at a time. And she'd learned that the people who tried to tear you down were usually the ones who were most afraid of what you might become. But most importantly, she'd learned that success wasn't measured in money or reputation or how many businesses you owned. Success was measured in the lives you touched, the opportunities you created, the legacy you left behind. And by that measure, Clara Whitlock had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. The shop in Red Bluff still stood, over 50 years after Clara had first opened it. It was run by her granddaughter now, a fierce young woman who'd inherited Clara's stubborn determination and refusal to back down. The production kitchen had expanded into a full bakery, employing over 30 women and supplying stores across 5 territories. And the ranch that had been Clara's sanctuary and her home for most of her life, thrived under Danny's management and would eventually pass to his children, and then to their children, carrying forward the legacy Clara and Cole had built together. Clara died on a quiet morning in early spring, surrounded by her family. She was 78 years old, and she went peacefully, with Cole holding her hand and Danny sitting at the foot of the bed. Her last words were simple. I did all right, didn't I? Cole smiled through his tears. You did better than all right. You did extraordinary. And he was right, because Clara Whitlock had started with nothing. A widow on a street corner with 6 pies and more fear than hope. And she'd turned that nothing into something that would last for generations. She'd proven that a woman could build an empire with nothing but flower and determination. She'd shown that strength wasn't about being perfect. It was about being persistent. She'd lived a life that mattered, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. The funeral was held at the ranch, and people came from all over the territory to pay their respects. Women who'd worked for Clara, men who'd bought her pies, families whose lives had been touched by her generosity and her refusal to give up. They told stories about the widow who'd stood on a street corner and refused to be beaten, about the businesswoman who'd built an empire from scratch, about the woman who'd given opportunities to hundreds of others and asked for nothing in return. And they remembered, because some people leave the world unchanged, but Clara Whitlock left it better than she found it. Her tombstone was simple, just her name, her dates, and a single line that Danny had chosen. She built something out of nothing, and she never stopped fighting. Years later, when Danny's granddaughter asked him what Clara had been like, he thought for a long moment. Then he said, "She was the strongest person I ever knew. Not because she never got scared, not because she never made mistakes, but because she kept going even when everything told her to stop. She taught me that success isn't about where you start. It's about what you do with what you've got." And she did everything. The girl nodded, trying to understand. "Do you miss her?" "Every single day. But I see her in everything we've built. In this ranch, in those shops, in the way we treat people and the chances we give them. She's not gone. She's just everywhere." And he was right. Because legacy isn't just what you leave behind when you die. It's what you build while you're alive. It's the lives you touch, the doors you open, the example you set. Clara Whitlock had built a legacy that would outlast her by generations. And every woman who walked into one of her shops, every employee who got a second chance, every family that prospered because Clara had refused to give up, they were all part of that legacy. So here's what I learned from Clara's story. You don't need permission to build something. You don't need approval from people who've already decided you'll fail. You just need courage, persistence, and the willingness to get back up when life knocks you down. Because the world will knock you down. It'll tell you you're not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy enough. It'll whisper that you should quit, that you should settle, that you should accept whatever scraps it's willing to give you, but you don't have to listen. You can choose to fight, to build, to prove that your worth isn't determined by where you started or what you've lost, or how many people doubt you. You can choose to be like Clara, to stand on that street corner with your pies and your dreams and refuse to be invisible, to take every setback and turn it into a step forward, to build something so undeniable that the people who tried to tear you down have no choice but to acknowledge what you've accomplished. It won't be easy. It never is. But it'll be worth it, because when you're 80 years old, sitting on your porch with the person you love, you won't regret the risks you took. You'll regret the ones you didn't. You won't remember the people who doubted you. You'll remember the ones who stood beside you. And you'll know, without question, that you lived a life that mattered. That's Clara's legacy. And it can be yours too.